Hello and welcome to Dateline London. I'm Ben Brown, and this week we pay tribute to one of the world's most remarkable women. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth has been on the British throne for a record 70 years this weekend. Also on the programme, we'll be looking at the diplomatic offensive to persuade President Putin not to invade Ukraine. Well, joining me in the studio to discuss all of that, Thomas Keelinger, Die Welt's veteran correspondent here in London. And virtually we have also the Sunday Times royal editor, Roy Nika, and the American journalist from Bloomberg News, Stephanie Baker. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being with us. Roy, why don't you kick us off with, because we're going to talk about 70 years this weekend since a 25-year-old Princess Elizabeth on safari with her husband learned that her father, George VI, had died. Suddenly, she had lost a father and become queen. Well, in the decades since, she has come to embody, really, the British monarchy and indeed modern British history. A living link to Churchill and the desperate days of the Second World War, and also a link to the winds of change as the British Empire collapsed. So, Roy, royal editor of the Sunday Times, for a woman who didn't originally expect to be queen, she's done a pretty extraordinary job over 70 years.
I think you're absolutely right, Ben. She has. And just listening to you sort of try and encapsulate that extraordinary 70 years is remarkable, thinking that, you know, her link back to Winston Churchill. We are 14 prime ministers on now, and the way things are going, perhaps we'll talk about it later, Boris Johnson might not be her last. And she has seen so much, and she, you know, has experienced so much. And yet one of the really extraordinary things I think about the Queen is that though it's been a long reign, 70 years, historic, no other British monarch has done that, and she is almost 96. I think one of the key things of the success of her reign is how the Queen has acknowledged that she needs to, perhaps slowly, but still absolutely embrace change and make sure that the monarchy evolves and this age-old institution keeps evolving. And I think that's one of the reasons why when, you know, we're constantly polled in this country about people's views of the monarchy is still very popular and the Queen is still so popular. But I think these images we're starting to see, and we'll see a lot more, I think, over the weekend of, you know, the Queen starting to mark that milestone. She is this most extraordinary historical figure. There's almost no one else like her in the world who has seen and experienced as much of her in terms of sort of politics, social, economical, political change. It's a remarkable feat.
Thomas, you have written about the Queen extensively, and you compared her to Queen Elizabeth I.
Well, yes, in my biography, I had to look at this issue because she herself, as a young queen in 1953, in her first Christmas broadcast, attached herself to this issue. What is the difference between myself and the Elizabethan age before me? I have to read you this quotation. It's significant. So the Queen then said, 1953, some people have expressed the hope that my reign may mark a new Elizabethan age. Frankly, I do not feel at all like my great Tudor forebear, who was blessed with neither husband or children, who ruled as a despot and was never able to leave her native shores. But there is at least one very significant resemblance between her age and mine. For her kingdom, small though it may have been, and poor by comparison with European neighbours, was yet great in spirit and well endowed with many men who were ready to encompass the earth. That to me is a difference, because who does encompass the earth now from Britain? The Queen herself. She's the most widely travelled monarch in the world. Robert Hardman, his last book, calls her Queen of the World. She travels and she is a global figure. And when I say global figure, I'm reminded, of course, of the theatre in which Shakespeare played and performed. That was called the Globe. So the country has been a global figure since those Tudor days. And why the Brexit people, for example, chose global Britain as a mantra to follow, I don't understand. It's always been global. Yeah. Now, politically, the country has declined. There's no question about it when you compare 1952 to 2022. But that is a different story. In the Tudor days, Britain was on the ascendancy, and she became a large, important power. Now it's declining. She's a middling player on the international stage, but she's still there, and she follows the motto of her predecessor, Elizabeth I, who used the Latin word semper eadem, always the same. She's been the same in all the changes that have happened around her.
Indeed. Stephanie, how do you think she's seen in America and around the world? What's the view of Queen Elizabeth?
I think she's incredibly popular, particularly in the United States. I mean, she's met, I believe, 12 US presidents. So she's as much a part of our history as she is, given her reign over 14 British prime ministers. So she, Americans love the Queen. Will lap up the pomp and pageantry of the Jubilee celebrations later this year. Prince William and Kate are very popular, but Prince Charles is less so. And I think one of the issues as well, I think that could overshadow, unfortunately, the Queen's Jubilee is the Prince Andrew trial in New York, in the U.S., by the case against him by Virginia Giuffre. And I think that does threaten to cast a dark shadow over the celebrations. If it goes to trial and does not settle, we could have a lot of unsavory testimony coming out. Virginia Giuffre is seeking the testimony of Prince Andrew's equerry, Robert Olney, as well as other testimony that could prove quite damaging, if it does go to trial. So I think that could cast a dark shadow over celebrations later this year. Likewise, Prince Harry's memoir that is due to come out later this year could also, come out with potentially embarrassing details and revive these allegations that were made during their interview with Oprah about someone in the royal family making a racist remark. And I think it's quite sad, actually, that such a momentous celebration could be kind of marred by both of those two things.
Roya, there have been dark shadows before, of course, during the 70-year reign, haven't there? And there was the Annus Horribilis and the claim that the royal family were perhaps out of touch after Diana's death. So there have been lows, haven't there, for the Queen?
There have been, and I think Stephanie has just succinctly summed up how much the Queen is still having to deal with on her plate at the age of 95. It's quite interesting. I've been writing quite a lot about the Queen recently, and there was very much a feeling, you mentioned the Annus Horribilis in 1992, the breakdown of some of her children's marriages, the burning of Windsor Castle. There was a feeling in royal circles in the run-up to the Golden Jubilee in 2002. No one quite knew how that was going to go. The royal family and monarchy had hit sort of lows in public opinion towards the end of the 90s. And yet the outpouring of affection for the Queen in 2002 took everyone by surprise, not even her. And I think people in royal circles felt that that was a bit of a page turn of the Golden Jubilee. And there was a feeling that the institution was sort of on the mend again. I think, actually, I have to just pick up, Thomas, on one thing. He says that, which I'm going to disagree with, that the Queen is no longer a big power player on the world stage politically. I know that the Queen has to be above politics, but I would disagree with that because I think the soft power she still deploys is enormous. And we keep seeing that. And at the G21, it was so interesting to me to see how everyone from Biden to Macron to Merkel, they were all jostling to be photographed next to her, the only unelected head of state among her. And the way the Queen was deployed to the G21, and of course at COP doing the remote virtual message, make no mistake, she's still above politics, but she is still a huge soft power player on the international stage.
Well, what do you say to that, Thomas? Because but she is, that's true, isn't it? No doubt about it.
No, I think you must have misunderstood what I meant to say. I was saying politics as a political power, Britain is diminished compared to when the Queen started. And Britain is no longer sort of a major world power. But as a figure of influence, the Queen stands above it all. And I quite agree with you that amazingly, despite all the change, she presides over a certain charisma almost that attaches itself to royalty and to Britain. But the monarchy itself does not explain what political power is in the world. It's a different thing. But I agree with you that the charisma of the monarchy is the abiding feature of how you recognize Great Britain in those 70 years. Nothing, no scandal, no transformation has been able to topple the British attachment to monarchy as the recognizable feature of your institutional stability.
Well, let's talk about that stability with Stephanie. I mean, do you think it really, her long reign, stability, as Thomas says, continuity really, has underpinned British democracy over all those decades?
Yes, I think it has. I mean, she is a constant. She has remained, steadfastly impartial. She is a steadying presence through times of crisis, and I think, she has definitely provided that continuity. And if you look at it, she is, in 2 years' time, will be the longest-serving monarch in history. She will surpass Louis XIV, and that is just an incredible achievement. And I think, without her, I think the country is facing real challenges for when she, the sad day comes when she does pass away, because I think there'll be a real transition and a real rethink of the monarchy when Prince Charles takes over. And I think there are a lot of questions about how it's managed. Prince Charles has talked about a slimmed down monarchy. Of course, we know much more about his political views than we do with the Queen. So I think he will have a harder time rising above the political fray as she has. And I think there'll be a real difficulty grappling with how prominent is Prince Charles? What role does he give to his more popular son, Prince William? And how do they navigate what can be very difficult political waters ahead?
Roy, last word to you on this. I think it's fair to say a lot of Republicans even have a respect for the Queen's, sense of duty, her hard work, her devotion to her role. But let's pick up on what Stephanie was talking about. How does the monarchy maintain its relevance? You were talking at the beginning about the need to modernise.
Absolutely, you're right. And it was interesting. I remember a quote from Prince William around the time of the Queen's 90th when he was interviewed for the BBC saying, one of my big challenges is how do I keep this relevant? How do I keep this modern for the future? And Stephanie's right. I was in Barbados recently for the handover with Prince of Wales as it became a republic. And there's no doubt that when the Queen is no longer with us in the future, our position in the world will change. And the great challenge for the Prince of Wales and Prince William will be, how do we keep it relevant? And I think Prince Charles is acutely aware of that, particularly given his age. He will be an old king. And I think his vision of a slimmed down monarchy is just part of it. We know he wants to open up the palaces. We know he wants to open up the private royal homes. He wants to bring the public closer to the monarchy. And I think there will be a lot of change under King Charles to modernise the monarchy when he becomes king.
Well, I said last word to Roy, but I think Thomas wants the last word on this.
Well, no, I just look forward to all the changes that we can expect, but I think I'm rather sanguine about the survivability of the institution. It is 1,000 years old, and throughout history there have been many on the throne who were not very liked, who were almost despised, the sons of George III and so forth, and the attachment of Great Britain as a country and as a people to its ancient institution is such that it is well likely to survive all the changes and the uncertainties that may come. I predict that this institution, kingdom in Britain, will be here to stay, and as long as there is a united kingdom, there will be a monarchy in Britain to recognise her as what she is. That is the antiquity of the institution.
All right, Thomas, thank you very much indeed. We're going to turn our attention now to the crisis over Ukraine, with well over 100,000 Russian troops massed on its borders. President Putin still very much keeping us guessing about whether or not he is indeed planning an invasion. Well, Boris Johnson flew to Kiev in a show of support for the Ukrainian president, while Mr. Putin has been meeting his Chinese counterpart, President Xi Jinping. The two allies stood shoulder to shoulder in demanding that NATO stops its eastward expansion. Stephanie, what do you think now in terms of the diplomatic efforts to try and stop an invasion, to stop a war in Ukraine, which could be incredibly bloody? Have those diplomatic efforts really got a chance?
I think they do. Look, it looks like Putin views the threat of an invasion as more useful than an actual invasion, which would be incredibly costly on many different levels.
So do you think he's bluffing, essentially?
No one can get inside Putin's head, obviously, but it does look like he is building up these forces. Remember, there were 90 to 100,000 troops on on the border back in April 2021. So although there has been an additional buildup and movement of forces since then, this has been ongoing for quite a while. I think he's, the sources we talk to seem to say that he's using this as leverage, as diplomatic leverage to get security guarantees that he wants.
But can he get those guarantees? Is the West going to give him those guarantees?
Well, I don't think they're going to give in to his demand that they guarantee that Ukraine never becomes part of NATO. That is a step too far. But there were some responses that were leaked, U.S. responses to Russia's demands that were leaked, which provided some openings, for strategic dialogue over, for instance, intermediate range nuclear missiles, which is something that Russia has been asking to start negotiating on for a while now. I think the U.S. made some overtures about not agreeing to deploy offensive weaponry in Ukraine. So I think there is some common ground. What you see coming out of Russia, I think, which is significant, is they keep banging this drum about implementing the Minsk agreements, which is the 2015 agreement, ceasefire to stop the fighting. And they want that to go forward through this Normandy format, which is Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine, to restart those talks. But fundamentally, Russia and Ukraine have different interpretations of that Minsk Accord and how to implement it. Russia wants to implement it in a way whereby you hold local elections in the Donbass, this eastern region, and reintegrate it with the rest of Ukraine and give it an autonomous status. Ukraine disagrees with that interpretation and wants to regain control of over its border with Russia there, then hold local elections and maybe give some special autonomy to the region. I think what Putin really wants is ultimately to use that as a way to destabilize Ukraine going forward. I mean, everyone talks about Putin as being this master strategist, but ultimately he miscalculated in 2014 by annexing Crimea and by backing separatists in the east of Ukraine, because he took the pro-Russian forces and Ukraine's political dialogue off the table. And so it united Ukraine, made it much more unified in its tilt to the West. Undermined his ability to, control through proxies. Okay. So I think his main goal is to try to destabilize Ukraine. I don't think he wants to march troops into Kiev.
I mean, Roya, it is quite a terrifying prospect, isn't it, that in 2022 we've got, more than 100,000 troops who could, I mean, we don't know, but it's possible, could mount an invasion, and there could be a really bloody war, in Europe.
It is a terrifying prospect, and I thought what was even more terrifying, actually, one of the things to think about was when Boris Johnson went over to Ukraine earlier this week and was there standing shoulder to shoulder with the president. We talked earlier on about our position in the world, and of course, all diplomatic routes being explored, and we're giving a lot of support to Ukraine. But Boris Johnson was just dogged during this press conference about what you described a terrifying prospect of war in Europe, with what was going on back home. And Thomas mentioned earlier on about, our position in the world on the international stage. And it feels at the moment that maybe even our attempts to sort of push the diplomatic route are damaged because of what's going on back here. And I think that is one of the more worrying aspects for us back home in terms of our position in the world and what can we actually do on the diplomatic stage when we have the distractions of Boris Johnson's leadership back here. But it is, as you say, an absolutely terrifying prospect. And it feels that leadership here is slightly distracted to deal with that. And that's worrying.
Thomas, what's your reading of what is Putin's game in all of this? What's his strategy?
Well, I think what are his sensitivities, which West misread 7 and more years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we thought the West had triumphed and so forth, and we expanded NATO. Really forgetting that, for one thing, Ukraine in the Russian sentiment is part of Russia in the sense that Kiev is one of the arch capitals of the old Russian identity. So should you move a friendly, albeit friendly alliance like NATO, right up to the border with Russia? I spent 8 years in America covering the US policy there from the White House. And you know, the Americans have such a thing as Monroe Doctrine, which does not allow a neighboring country around America to have an alliance with another force which would likely position its weapons in the neighborhood of the US. Should we not have recognized Russia's, as it were, entitlement to a similar treatment, that no kind of organized alliance should come close to their borders with troops and defense alliances? That was a mistake. So to what extent can you satisfy Putin's request that this not happen? I think to say that Ukraine is not right to join and so forth, she's a free country, she can do what she likes, but there has to be behind the scenes some diplomatic understanding that the issue of NATO moving up to the frontier of Russia is not a viable one, not a useful one. It will only incense the Russian sentiments, while at the same time I totally find unacceptable for Russia to occupy Ukraine territory and countryside. But we have not really dealt properly with Russia's concern as a big power for another alliance to come to their borders and appear to be threatening. They overblow this threat, of course, it is for their interest, but we should sign, the diplomatic solution should be about allowing Ukraine to be a free country without a promise to become a NATO ally. That would be foolhardy, and we need to get off that position completely.
Stephanie, you were based in Moscow. What's your sense of what the Russian people think of this? I know it's, of course, massively hard to generalise, especially from a distance. But do you think they share President Putin's anger about a sort of eastward expanding NATO, or do you think maybe Putin's just using all of this to sort of try and shore up his support at home? I mean, he's got a lot of economic problems at home.
Yeah, I don't think there's any real support in Russia for an all-out invasion of Ukraine, particularly amongst the younger generation, who would have to be fighting on the front line in this war. He hasn't been talking it up in the way that you might expect to drum up support for such a huge military action.
I mean, it could be another Afghanistan or another Chechnya in which Russian troops just get bogged down. Right,
exactly. And, I don't think anyone thinks that they can march their forces into Ukraine, into Kiev and beyond, and actually hold it without it being incredibly costly, both in terms of lives and in terms of financial costs, as well as the possibility of sanctions. I do think Russians like seeing their leader as a strong figure on the world stage, and he has achieved that by this military buildup. He's gotten the attention of the West. He's managed to then get NATO to sit down with him. He's restarted this Normandy format talks on the situation in eastern Ukraine. And I think in that sense, there's support for his actions. But a full-scale military invasion, I don't see that now.
Thomas, just briefly, do you think war can be avoided?
Well, I think Putin knows the unconscionable consequences that would appear if he did invade. I think he calculates quite well the risks that he is himself running. And so I think he will step away from that threat. He makes these blustery noises, of course, to convince the West that he has sensitivities that need to be satisfied. But I don't think he is in reality planning to occupy and to
I mean, he could mount a partial invasion rather than invading the whole country.
Yeah, well, a partial invasion is as good as an invasion, come whatever you might call it. It is an invasion, period. And a partial invasion is as good as a proper all-out war. It is war. It is a violation of international territorial accords and absolutely unacceptable. He knows that the consequences will be such as to outweigh the pros and the profit that he hopes to gain from it. I just think that he can calculate quite well what he has lined up against him to stay away from the ultimate threat of occupying Ukraine. He got away with Crimea at a time when we weren't really paying attention, but the next step is a whole different ball game, and I don't think it's likely to happen in the immediate future. So I think he will refrain from it in his own mind.
All right, Thomas, thank you very much indeed. And thanks to Stephanie and Roya as well. Very good to have you all with us. And that is, I'm afraid, all we've got time for this week. Many thanks again to all my guests, Thomas Kielinger, Roya Nika and Stephanie Baker. And thanks very much to you too for watching. Please do join us on Dateline again next week. Same time, same place. Goodbye from all of us.